Hello, all. Thank you so much for joining us for Equity Consideration for California's Transportation. We will be starting in just a minute. We're letting a few more join us on the line. There we go. Today's Monday, August 23rd. Thank you so much for joining us. Next slide. My name is Carly Brown, and I will be your host and moderator today. I am the Assistant Executive Director for the Institute for Local Government. Next slide. At the Institute for Local Government, we do many webinars. This is just one of them. So today's agenda, we'll go ahead and do some welcome and logistics. We'll do an introduction to the Climate Smart Transportation and Communities Consortium. We will have presentations by Dalia Garris, Jen Giuliano, Caroline Rodier, Abigail Solis, Alexandra Pan, and Hannah Krieger. We will then follow that by a panel discussion. We'll leave time for some Q&As to get your questions answered. And then we'll do a wrap up and we'll bring you additional resources. Next slide. A few logistics before we get started. If you want to ask a question, go ahead and select the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar. You can type any technology and content questions into the Q&A box at that time. I'll go ahead and read those questions during the Q&A portion of this webinar. And if you'd like right now, feel free to go ahead and put your name and affiliation in the chat. We're going to try to make this somewhat interactive if we can. You can go ahead and put some comments as we're going through those presentations as well. Please just make sure they're respectable and on content. Next slide. As I mentioned, I'm with the Institute for Local Government. We're the nonprofit training and education affiliate of the League of California Cities, CSAC, and California Special Districts Association. We really work to provide practical and easy to use resources to help local governments and their partners do things better. Next slide. We have several different programs. We have leadership and governance, civics and workforce education, public engagement, and sustainable communities. Like I said, we do training and education. We provide technical assistance, capacity building, and convening. So we're so happy to have you there. We really love to share best practices and lessons learned. And we are really excited today to present this panel of incredible women who have done some really great research and have some great insights to provide with you today. Next slide. So without further ado, here is our prestigious panel. We have Hannah Krieger, a senior program climate equity manager for the Green Lining Institute. We have Alex Pan, who is a PhD student in the Transportation Sustainability Research Center at UC Berkeley. Abigail Solis, who is a Sustainable Energy Solutions Manager at Self-Help Enterprises. Caroline Rodier, who is a researcher at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. Jen Giuliano, who's a professor, and the Margaret and John Ferrero Chair in Effective Local Government Director in the MetTrans Transportation Center at the USC School of Public Policy. And last but not least, we have Dalia Garris, who's a research program director of PH&EV Research Center at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. So we're going to go ahead and get started with Dalia. Next slide, and take it away, Dalia.
Thank you so much. My name is Dalia Garris. I'm the program manager. Kind of my full-time job is for the Plug-in Hybrid and Electric Vehicle Research Center at UC Davis. And I also have been managing this consortium with UC Davis, UC Berkeley, UCLA, UC Irvine, UC Riverside, and the University of Southern California. So a great batch of amazing researchers that have come together to form this Climate Smart Transportation and Communities Consortium with funding from the Strategic Growth Council. Go ahead. Next slide, please. So what we call the CSTACS research program is organized around 5 areas: innovative mobility, electrification, public transit, land use and active transportation, and goods movement, freight. But equity and policy engagement are cross-cutting themes across all of the research areas. So it's a very broad consortium, and something where we're really trying to dig in a little bit to the equity considerations related to transportation and communities in all of the research projects. Next slide. Thank you. So our program, our consortium, is set up with 3 statewide initiatives and 3 local initiatives. The statewide initiatives are looking at the 3 revolutions in transportation, so sharing, automation, and electrification. Those are our 3 revolutions in transportation. We have programs related to accelerating the transition to zero emission vehicles, and then a statewide transportation modeling initiative as well. Next slide. On the regional initiatives, we have a program in Southeast Los Angeles, and Jen Juliana will be speaking about the project that she's working on there. We have a group looking at the Inland Empire led by UC Riverside, and really focused on 3 revolutions and freight in particular there. And then we have the Central Valley Regional Initiative, and we'll be hearing from Caroline Rodier about that program today as well. Next slide. So in addition to the research program, we have what we call the TJAG, our Transportation Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Group. And the TJAG is a group of representatives from communities, from like local government, from community-based organizations, from nonprofits that are engaging with us on a regular basis to help advise and give feedback on the research to make sure that we are kind of staying connected to the communities that we're trying to understand. This TJAG also has representatives that serve on specific project advisory groups. And the TJAG is really led by the Center for Regional Change at UC Davis. And we do have a representative from our TJAG here today as well. Hannah Krieger is joining us to give us a little bit of feedback from their perspective. Next slide. So thank you. That's hopefully a really quick overview for the CSTAC. We are launching a website, and our reports will be added as they become available to cstac.ucdavis.edu. And if you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to answer them if you want to reach out via email. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much, Dahlia. Next, Jen Juliana will be joining us to talk about the Southeast Los Angeles project. Oh, Jen, we're going to need you to go off mute.
We've already started with the go off mute. Anyway, thank you, everyone. It's good to see over 100 people tuned in. So this is a wonderful audience, and I will try to keep my share of time down to the 10 minutes. So this is case study 1 in Southern California. The research faculty team was me, my colleague Marlon Bornett, and Miguel Yaller at UC Davis. Next. So our case study was in what we call the Sella area, and our partners were numerous, as I will describe in just a minute. We're in Southeast Los Angeles County. Believe it or not, there's a population there of 750,000 in a mere 62 square miles. So it's a very high density settled place. The area includes 8 cities plus several incorporated areas. We're at about 85–86% Hispanic. And the Callen-Viro screen identifies this area as both high pollution and high population burden. In our case, we had two objectives. One was to reduce the environmental impacts of freight traffic, and the other one was to improve transit mobility and job access. So I will talk a little bit about each of those. As was already described, this project has been very much grounded in community engagement. Our main partner is the SELA Collaborative, which is an umbrella organization. It's a nonprofit that's actually a collection of several other nonprofit organizations. And their objective or their role is to raise their influence, their political influence on issues that affect that area. We had also the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State Los Angeles with us, various public agencies and other community stakeholders. Next. So this is a complicated slide, but I wanted to let you know sort of what happens when you engage the community. So on the left side, that's kind of the flow chart of the freight study. And all the blue boxes are the things that we had intended to do at the outset of the research. The green boxes are the things that we ended up doing as a result of our focus groups that we held. So basically, when we started, we thought that our analysis was going to be all about reducing impacts of trucks, mainly on the pollution side. Our focus group told us that while pollution is certainly important and of concern, of greater concern to them was traffic safety and the truck danger that they faced every day from trucks running around the neighborhood. So we changed our research and actually included a crash analysis in our approach. On the transit side, our focus group similarly, the blue boxes were what we intended to do, and the green boxes are what we added to the project as a result of engagement with the community. And that engagement told us that there was a lot of concern about transit service quality, never mind the headways on buses, and never mind where I could come and go on a bus. What was equally important was, will the bus actually stop and pick me up and things like that. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of how we restructured the research as a result of community engagement. Next. So I'm going to go through quickly 3 slides that summarize our results. We divided our freight analysis into 2 pieces. One was the regional freight piece, and the other was local. The reason we did that is that most of the truck traffic that goes through this area is really through traffic as a result of the general activity of goods movement in Southern California. This is the part that was done by Miguel Yaller at UC Davis. There were 3 scenarios that were simulated. I won't go into the details, but basically first was to look at all of the regulations on the books in California up to the year 2020. This was done in 2019 and 2020. And then the second scenario was that on top of all of the planned and current regulations. So it adds the new targets for zero emission trucks and things like that. And then the third one was what is more operational, and that is shifting trucks to other routes or time periods. As you might guess, scenario 2, which has the most aggressive shifting of trucks to zero emission, gives you the most reductions in the area. Next. In terms of local freight, we did a crash analysis. We found that crashes per capita are higher in the SELA area than in the region as a whole. And believe it or not, over half of all these truck crashes occur on local streets rather than the highways and ramps. It was very clear to find these hot spots, and most of the problems were related to unsafe speed, improper turns, and not giving the right of way. We did a hotspot analysis and we selected 5 locations, which are numbered on the map there. For further analysis, we went out into the field. We did windshield surveys because this was during COVID, so we couldn't do anything more than that. And we found a lot of problems just with visual, being able to see around corners, geometry, traffic flow, and all of that. And then we narrowed down to 2 to do these very detailed micro simulations and to see if by, for example, redesigning intersections, we could reduce some of the danger. Next. Okay, on we go to accessibility. This is the transit part. And of course, it's no surprise that access to jobs by transit is much lower than access to car. And what we did here was use something called a remix package, which allows us to simulate trips through the transit network. And so what we did was try 3 things. One was to say, let's just get all the buses in Cella to 10-minute headways. The second one was all the buses 10-minute headways for any route that went through Cella. And then the third was to accelerate the speed for access to and from bus stops by bicycle or shuttle. And what we found is that the third alternative actually increases access about twice as much as reducing headways. Next. So that was what we found, and we'll get to some recommendations later. We also conducted a bus user survey. This was interrupted and affected by COVID, so we did not get to do the onboard type of survey we wanted to do. But we got plenty of information on people who have had the experience of a bus driving by without stopping, even though there was room on the bus. There was also lots of discussions about the low frequency, the feeling of not being safe, dangerous passengers, dirty buses, and all kinds of things like that. Needless to say, we were working with LA Metro on this, and so they were concerned that their surveys didn't reflect what our surveys reflected, and that was mainly because, of course, we were on the ground in a specific community. Next. Okay, so very quickly, some recommendations that we had. First was, of course, that we want to broaden the audience for our study results and recommendations. Because of COVID, we were not able to hold a town meeting as we had hoped to be able to do, to bring in hundreds of people as opposed to 50. So that is still on the docket if we could possibly do it later. We suggest that clean heavy-duty truck pilot programs be taken up within the Cella area, that Cella be an area for demos, that it be an area for infrastructure investment so that we can accelerate the conversion of vehicles in that particular area. We are recommending that we now work with cities, and especially Cella, the collaborative work with cities, now that we have identified these specific intersections and other safety problems, to work directly to see what we can do to solve them. We also are recommending bicycle facility bike sharing, and so on, to accelerate or to enhance transit access and improve pedestrian safety. We also recommend working directly with LA Metro to further explore the transit service quality issues that we discovered. Also to encourage bike sharing and micro forms of transit to increase access to transit stations, and to encourage Metro to kind of expand its demos in this area to the Sella area. And I believe that's the last slide, and I believe I'm only 1 minute out.
Thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciate the detail you shared and learning how you refined and adapted your research throughout the project. Thanks so much. From Southeast LA, we're going to head on over to the Central Valley and hear from Caroline Rodier and Abigail Solis.
Hi, good morning. Today I'm going to talk about equity and greenhouse gas effects of an electric car sharing pilot in California's Central Valley. I'll be presenting pre-COVID results today. We're just about finishing up our post-COVID results. Next slide, please. So MeoCar is an electric vehicle car sharing service located in affordable housing developments in rural low-income communities. MeoCar is a nonprofit and is currently funded by the California Air Resources Board. Next slide. MeoCar is located in the southernmost counties of the Central Valley in Tulare and Kern County. It's located in 6 communities and 8 affordable housing complexes with charged parking spaces. It includes 27 vehicles with ranges that are suitable for rural driving. And the service costs about $4 a day, $35 for an entire weekday, and $45 for an entire weekend day. Next slide. The San Joaquin Valley is a Central Valley excluding the Sacramento region. It is California's single most productive agricultural region and one of the most productive in the world. It produces more than half of the fruits, vegetables, and nuts grown in the United States. In this map, you can see that the valley is dominated by agricultural lands. The smaller pink areas are residential and commercial lands. California has classified most of the valley as facing significant barriers to economic prosperity and a healthy environment. It has some of the worst air quality in the nation and high rates of childhood asthma. Next slide. Okay, now I'm just going to talk, oh, sorry, we're a little bit behind. Next slide, please. There, great. And I just wanted to touch on the origin story a bit. So the San Joaquin Valley Transportation Agencies, the 8 MPOs and transit agencies, wanted to develop a path to increase access and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in rural areas of their region. This was around 2013. Rural areas, as many know, are particularly challenging for transportation planners because it's difficult to provide high quality fixed route transit. Thus, personal vehicles are often essential to access most destinations. But they are also often beyond the financial reach of many very low income households. The 8 Valley MPOs partnered with UC Davis researchers to embark on a community-based planning study that explored shared mobility alternatives. The study was funded by the California Department of Transportation. The project included extensive stakeholder outreach, data collection, and data analysis to identify transport disadvantaged communities, compare shared mobility service concepts, and develop community partners. It culminated in a consensus about 3 promising pilot options, one of which was MeoCar. These pilots were ultimately funded by a grant from the California Air Resources Board. Next slide, please. The data collected for this study includes member use data and survey data. Member use data includes data on each member reservation, including date and time, revenue, duration, and VMT. The initial survey is administered when a user joins the service and includes questions related to personal vehicles, socioeconomic attributes, reason for joining the program, and expected use. The post-reservation survey is administered after a member completes a reservation and includes data on the reservation. For example, what was the purpose of the travel? How many passengers did you carry in your vehicle? How did you access the hub? And counterfactual travel. Okay, next slide. The initial results, survey results indicated that our members belong to households that have relatively larger household sizes, lower medium incomes, and lower vehicle availability. That is compared to the county in which they live and the values for pilot census block groups. The socioeconomic data, oh, sorry, next slide. The socioeconomic data integrated with members' usage data enabled some insight into potential factors that predict the frequency of using Meocar. So we found that 3 or more adults in a household, lack of access to vehicles, and household adults each earning less than $15,000 a year were predictive of higher use of the service. Next slide, please. We also have data on the census block in which Meocar members live. In this map, you can see that the green dots represent Meocar hubs, and the size of the pink circles represents Meocar levels in area communities. Many members live outside of the Meocar hubs, and many of these communities are some distance from the Meocar hubs. Okay, next slide. Okay, this slide and the next use counterfactual data on how travel by Meocar would have been accomplished without the presence of Meocar. This slide documents results related to new travel enabled by Meocar. We can see that over half of respondents expected and stated that their travel with Meocar would not have been possible without the service. This suggests that the service is increasing access to opportunities for Meocar members. Okay, next slide, please. The post-reservation survey asked users who indicated that they still would have traveled even without access to Meocar, how they would have traveled. 95% indicated they would have used a different mode, and that mode would have been a personal vehicle or a car rental. Only 5% indicated they would have traveled to a different destination. Next slide. So the counterfactual data from the post-reservation surveys, the data I presented in 2 previous slides, were applied to member user data. And the survey results suggested a 15% replacement rate of conventional VMT with electric VMT for the service, and a 75% generation rate of new electric VMT. Next slide, please. So these are early results, and they're exploratory, descriptive only. We still had, during this phase, we still had a limited number of respondents. The evaluation is ongoing and it should be updated soon, but the next phase refers to the COVID period, and that will of course be somewhat atypical. But in any event, during the ramp up period, this data, early data, appears to address some transport inequities in the communities. So members belong to households with lower incomes and fewer personal vehicles. Frequency of use is inversely related to income and personal vehicle access. And members largely make trips they could not make without the service. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm just going to end with some thoughts. The pre-pilot evaluation showed that there really is no easy way to expand access to low-income rural populations. We identified car sharing and volunteer ride sharing as some of the more promising solutions in our study areas. However, we needed to work with community partners to launch a nonprofit car sharing organization because we really weren't able to find a for-profit organization willing to serve our pilot areas. Okay, so social justice, electric vehicle miles traveled, increasing access to address the needs of underserved communities may increase vehicle travel, but use of electric vehicles can mitigate and even reduce greenhouse gas emissions. More research will be coming in the future on this with larger sample sizes. Programs may require ongoing public support. In the meantime, exploring approaches to increase revenues is needed. We're interested in testing hubs in more central urban areas to help offset costs from the rural hubs. We're also interested in group memberships for organizations that need to help their clients travel. For example, community health clinics, HMOs, affordable housing development, and transitional housing programs. Okay, next slide. I just want to acknowledge my co-authors, Brian Harold and Yunwan Zhang from ITS Davis. I'd also like to give a shout out to Gloria Huerta. She is the general manager of Meocar and helped us a lot with the data collection. Her contributions were really important. Okay, and then I just want to have another shout out for all our project partners, Kern Council of Governments and Tulare Council of Association and Governments and Self-Help Enterprises and all our other terrific partners. Okay, and that's it.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Caroline. Really fascinating research there. I'm going to quickly turn to Abigail Solis to share more about the community engagement aspect.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to follow up on Caroline's presentation, but I really want to inject the community engagement perspective part of this research project. So I am Abigail Solis, and I am the manager of our Sustainable Energy Solutions Department at Self-Help Enterprises. Next slide. And just a little bit about Self-Help for those who may not know who we are. We are a nationally recognized community development and affordable housing organization located in the San Joaquin Valley. Our service area is comprised of 8 counties in the San Joaquin Valley, and most of those counties are heavy agricultural areas. The mission of Self-Help Enterprises is to work together with low-income families to build and sustain healthy homes and healthy communities. Since 1965, we have touched the lives of over 55,000 families, together with our affordable housing development work, as well as our community development work. And for this program, Meocar, we act as the hub for the vehicles in Tulare and Kern County. And we were also the lead on the outreach and community engagement portion, which is critical, and I'll talk more about that. Next slide. So I just want to set the story of the San Joaquin Valley and the various community needs. I think it's important to understand this when you think about how transportation plays into the overall picture of community needs in the San Joaquin Valley. Even prior to participating in this research project, Self-Help Enterprises has had the opportunity to collect data through various different efforts, one being a separate SGC grant that we received, where we were able to go out to over 25 communities and collect infrastructure improvement information from small disadvantaged communities in the San Joaquin Valley. And what we learned is that the San Joaquin Valley communities are dealing with multiple issues, not only transportation. One being that they have very high energy costs. So it costs more for these families to heat and cool their home than other families across the state and more affluent areas. These are families that are dealing with contaminated drinking water. So many of them have to spend extra money to buy bottled water because they cannot drink the water that comes out of their tap. Many are dealing with negative health impacts, asthma, valley fever, very prevalent in these areas. A lot of these communities are dealing with high air pollution rates due to many people still burning wood to heat their homes, using propane and various other factors that come into play. The San Joaquin Valley is also a very high, has very high rates of COVID. Throughout this entire pandemic, our area has been known as a high rate area, and we're still dealing with that today. Some of the other information that we collected specifically about transportation is that when you live out in a rural community, these families have a longer commute to school, to doctor's appointments, and even to the grocery stores. Just to give you an idea, there are many communities that have to travel 10 to 15 miles to get to the nearest full-on grocery store or the nearest hospital. And that is typical across the San Joaquin Valley small rural areas. So that just shows you how important reliable transportation is to these families. Other than perhaps a bus that comes around a few times a day, there are very few options for these families. Most of them either take a bus, a taxi, or have to pay a friend or relative to give them a ride. These transportation options are usually very inconvenient and expensive. We have been told that it can cost a family over $100 if they pay a taxi or a friend or a relative to give them a ride into the nearby city to go to a doctor's appointment. And when it comes to electric vehicles, most of these communities do not have one electric vehicle charging station in their community, and the nearest one may be 10, 15, 20, 30 miles away. Next slide. So MioCar presents a unique and really exciting opportunity for the residents of the San Joaquin Valley. And in addition to all of the great information that Caroline provided, I want to give just some additional context for you to consider. MioCar provides for many the first opportunity to see an electric vehicle, to ride inside one, and to drive one. So of course, this is an exciting opportunity for folks who may not have this opportunity if it wasn't for MioCar. MioCar addresses both the transportation gap that I referred to in my previous slide, as well as helps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in an area that has high pollution. And it provides real savings. Most of the residents that we serve are very low income. In the San Joaquin Valley, many of the jobs are low paying jobs. And because of that, money is a real issue. And many families have a tight budget. So if you can provide a family with a much more affordable option for transportation to their doctor's appointment, that is going to make a real impact in the family's budget. And this firsthand experience, not only does it provide the first exciting experience, but when you think about the long-term goal, when you think about the fact that we really need to help these communities engage in the clean energy transition, this is a perfect opportunity to get someone the experience and hopefully convince them to purchase an electric vehicle in the future. This helps to make that happen because it gives them that first exposure. Next slide. I really want to take some time to talk about the importance of education and capacity building, because regardless of what program you're talking about, you can have a very great program with great benefits to customers, to residents, to families. But if families are not engaging in your program, then of course we cannot be successful. Like I mentioned, Self-Help Enterprises was responsible for all of the outreach and engagement for this project. So a little bit about what we did to engage families is we understood that for most of these families, the need was there, but they could have been intimidated because they have never used an electric vehicle, and that can shy people away from this. So because we understood that, we provided opportunities for folks to come and see the vehicles, touch it, connect the charger, disconnect the charger. We held many, in-person events. This was pre-COVID. And as you see here, opportunities for residents to come and see the vehicles, ask any questions, and that is absolutely critical. Through this grant, we were able to have some funding to be able to provide this technical assistance to families that they wouldn't otherwise have had. we created a safe space for families to ask questions. A lot of times, especially in the Hispanic community, people tend to be prideful and may not want to speak up. This provided a very intimate space where everyone felt comfortable asking questions. We were doing things like helping people download the app on their phone. When we explained to people that you can't download an app unless you have an email address, we found ourselves helping people create an email address for the first time. So things that you may not think about ahead of time are critical to get people to participate in the programs. And all of those things are the things that Self-Help Enterprises was able to support and ultimately led to people participating in the program. Next slide. The other thing that we did with MeoCar is we really focused on building community partnerships as well as the community engagement. We partnered with multiple schools, clinics, counties, everywhere where we had cars. We partnered with the different community-based organizations located in those communities. What this did is it allowed us to market our program in a different way. We did not do commercials. We did not buy airtime, or we didn't do very much social media or online marketing. Instead, we took these cars out to give people a firsthand opportunity to see the cars. So you'll see here, there's a picture of MeoCars in at a high school at a local event where many of the students came around to ask questions about these cars and how you drive them. Again, it was the first time that they were actually seeing these cars. And again, it plants the idea in your mind that perhaps you can have an EV one day. What we did is we went out and we asked people if they would help us by becoming a partner, sharing the information, and ultimately those partners became MeoCar members as well. So we have school districts who wanted to become partners and use the vehicles for various reasons at their school district, as well as clinics and other local agencies. It is really important that whenever you're trying to build trust in a community around the new program, that you connect with community-based organizations, because they really are the local trusted voice in these small communities. Next slide. When you think about the most vulnerable communities in the San Joaquin Valley and across the state of California, these are often the communities that are overlooked. And I think it's really important to think about how we can avoid overlooking these most vulnerable communities as we move forward and help California reach its very aggressive clean energy goals for 2030 and 2050. We can't reach those goals if we do not include the most vulnerable communities. And I think that we have an opportunity right now to put those communities ahead of the line instead of last like they usually are. When these communities are the most impacted, and a lot of them are producing some of the most, the highest emissions across the state, if we can start with these communities first, then I think we get ahead of the game, and we can work on our solutions together with the residents in these small communities to make a bigger difference across the state. The success that we've had with MeoCar, I think, shows us that programs like this, car sharing, electric vehicle car sharing, should be scaled up and should be used across the San Joaquin Valley and across California. Next slide. So a few policy and funding recommendations that I've learned from this program and other electric vehicle programs that we are working on in the San Joaquin Valley is, any funding source needs to prioritize underserved communities. Also, we need to install electric vehicle charging stations across the San Joaquin Valley low-income communities now. We need to get those charging stations out there so that people can want to buy cars, electric vehicles, and use those charging stations. Right now, we are in a dilemma because if we try to market an EV to a community with no electric vehicle charging stations, then they have no reason to buy one if they can't charge it in their own community. So we need to really focus on getting those charging stations in these communities. Also, we need to provide ongoing public support for programs like MeoCar, because they do offer such a valuable service to the general public. It's very important that this support does come from public programs. I think it's important to offer incentives for partnerships with low-income housing providers like South Help Enterprises, and give these low-income multifamily housing complexes a reason, to an incentive to provide this type of service at their site. I think it's very important for all funding sources to include funding for technical assistance and pay community-based organizations to do the work similar to what South Help did here for Meocar. And important also is to include funding for adequate community outreach and engagement, because like I mentioned before, any program can be great, but unless you're working directly with the residents, we run the risk of not being successful. And adequate community outreach and engagement and education increases our chances of being successful. Next slide. If you would like any information about our community outreach and engagement, how we work with low-income and disadvantaged communities, feel free to reach out to me. This is my information here. But I just want to add that it has been such a pleasure to work with Caroline at UC Davis, as well as all the other folks that have been involved in the project, and we look forward to continuing. Thank you.
Thank you, Abigail, for providing such great context and insight. We really appreciate your efforts on this project. And I know so much of what you just said will resonate with a lot of our audience members for their projects that they might be working on as well. So let's keep traveling up north to the Bay Area. We have next Alex Pan, who will share some more about her research project. Take it away, Alex.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex, and I'm presenting on behalf of the UC Berkeley Transform and Lift team on our project, leveraging the 3 revolutions to create equitable and sustainable communities. Next slide. The motivation behind the research was the idea that shared mobility and innovative forms of transportation have the potential to fill accessibility gaps of low-income individuals by being more flexible and convenient than public transit and a potentially cheaper alternative than private vehicle ownership. At the same time, the adoption and use of shared mobility by low-income individuals lags behind other demographic groups. So we worked on our project team with our partners at Transform and Lift, Transform being a community-based organization in the Bay Area, to come up with a set of research questions to guide this work. Through our collaboration and through some expert interviews with other transportation professionals and other CDOs, we found that any research on low-income communities has to first focus on defining their specific transportation needs, and then identifying the ways that shared mobility can be an additional tool to meet those needs. So those insights really guided the first 2 questions you see on the slide. And our last research question was on how shared mobility operators, public agencies, and nonprofit organizations can help facilitate the access, awareness, and use of shared mobility by low-income people. Next slide. Our study site is Oakland, California. Oakland is the largest city in the East Bay region of the San Francisco Bay Area. 64% of Oakland residents live in communities of concern, which are census tracts designated by the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the Bay Area, MPC, and are defined based on the percent of minority residents, low-income residents, and other criteria to evaluate the social equity impacts of planning projects. And for our project, we define our low-income population as rent-burdened residents, or those who spend more than 30% of their income on rent. We chose this definition after discussions with Transform. In her work in the community, our partner Clarissa found that there was a significant population of residents who didn't qualify for low-income discounts, but were still struggling with the cost of living and with transportation costs. So using the definition rent burdened instead of other definitions of low income, such as 200% of federal poverty line, would allow us to capture this broader population, while at the same time highlighting the connection between housing costs and transportation accessibility. Next slide. To study our research questions, we took a mixed methods approach using both qualitative and quantitative analyses. So we first conducted focus groups with rent-burdened East Oakland residents to finalize our research questions and gather some initial data on the transportation needs and barriers of Oakland residents. Then, due to COVID, we shifted our data collection to online and socially distant methods, deploying an online survey and conducting phone and video interviews with rent-burdened Oakland residents. Finally, my colleague Jessica Lazarus and Jeff Greenblatt, they conducted agent-based simulation modeling to study the sensitivity of regional travel behavior to policy initiatives that expand access to pooled TNC rides for low-income groups. Next slide. Now I'll present some of our key findings. In our focus groups survey and interviews, we found that rent-burdened residents, particularly those without a personal vehicle, are using a diverse mix of transportation modes, including both public transit and shared mobility, to meet their travel needs. So as one example, the majority of non-car owners within our respondents would use TNCs when they needed car access, followed by car sharing. It was less likely that these non-car owners would get a ride from a friend or family member or borrow a car. Our research participants also shared that public transit costs were a major financial barrier, especially for BART, which is the heavy rail system in the Bay Area. And in some cases, it constrained the ability of focus group participants and interviewees to look for jobs. The perceptions of public transit were also dependent on respondents' geographic location, reason for use, and temporal trip characteristics. So the top quote on the right comes from a person who would take the bus during commute hours and live near downtown Oakland. And they said, "I would regularly run into the same folks on the bus. We were all commuting home at the same time and just helped me feel more connected." And this sentiment was echoed by other commuters and other residents who lived in downtown Oakland, who saw public transit as either productive time where they could get some work done or catch up on their messages or talk to their family, or as a way to feel connected to their community. In contrast, the lower quote comes from someone who lives in East Oakland, where there's less access to public transit, and she would take buses in between community college campuses during the day. She eventually got so frustrated with the bus that she learned how to drive in her 20s and said, "I always say it's the bus's fault that I started driving." Next slide. In terms of shared mobility, we found there was high awareness of shared modes among research participants, and the majority had either heard of shared modes or seen them in the street. But what's interesting is that for some modes like scooter sharing, just seeing the scooter on the sidewalk was enough for residents to try it for the first time. In contrast, for car sharing and bike sharing, even residents who walked by bike sharing stations every day or car sharing vehicles every day said that they wanted someone to teach them or guide them how to use it. So this kind of indicates that there's some modes that may require more hands-on education and training, like Abigail had talked about in the previous presentation, to adopt, while other modes, just like the physical presence of vehicles in the street is enough. Next slide. From the agent-based simulation work, we found that when subsidizing all TNC trips, the majority of new trips were shifted away from public transit and active modes. So this means that any additional environmental benefits of shared automated or shared automated electric vehicle technology would be negated by this mode shift away from public transit and active modes. Additionally, subsidies for pooled TNC rides are effective at shifting mode share away from ride-alone TNCs. However, targeting these subsidies for low-income pooled TNC riders resulted in smaller increases in the pooled match rate. So this means that would reduce the likelihood that a requested pool ride would be matched and limits the potential benefits of offering that type of targeted subsidy. Next slide. So now I'll discuss some of our policy priorities that came out of this work. Our first is to consider using rent burdened as a proxy for low income. Our analysis of rent burdened households revealed, similar to what Clarissa had found from her work in the community, that many households don't qualify for low income programs such as CalFresh, Bike Share for All, or the Clipper Start program, which is a public transit discount. But these households still struggle to make ends meet. So expanding the scope of low income programs to a wider population of rent burdened households could increase transportation accessibility for these households. Next slide. Another policy priority is to consider developing integrated mobility wallets or mobility on demand and mobility as a service platforms that build on existing regional public transit passes such as Clipper Card in the Bay Area. As I mentioned earlier, one of our main findings is that rent burdened residents use a diverse mix of public and private transportation options. And in focus groups and interviews, our research respondents expressed preferences for a more integrated and seamless kind of platform. And this type of integrated platform would not only make it easier for trip planning and budgeting, it would also allow users to compare travel times and costs more easily across different modes. Next slide. Next slide. From our agent-based simulation work, we recommend considering a fee-based structure for transportation pricing. So in a fee-based structure, fees would be applied to ride-along TNC services and could cover the costs of providing pooling subsidies for particular populations. Incentivizing pooling, we found, is important to increase the widespread adoption of pooling, which would then increase the match rate and reduce wait time for pooled rides. The fee-based structure can also support underserved communities in overcoming financial barriers of on-demand mobility. Next slide. For further reading, our full reports are available at the links on the slide. The first report focuses on the findings from the focus group survey and interviews, while the second report focuses on findings from the modeling work. Next slide. We would like to thank our project partners at Transform and Lift, the various CBOs that helped us recruit research participants, and the rest of the research team at TSRC, as well as commenters and reviewers of the modeling work. And finally, we would like to thank all of the research participants for their invaluable insights and contributions. Next slide. And then this is the contact information for the research team. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions and to the panel later.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm really loving the variety in the research, the approach, the methodologies, the outcomes. I do want to remind everyone that we will be sending out the slide deck after the presentations, so you don't have to copy down everyone's email address. And I'd also like you to remind you to go ahead and keep those questions coming in the Q&A box. I really appreciate it. Next, we will be going to Hannah Krieger. She is with the Green Lining Institute, and she was also part of our TJAG group. So we will hear more from her coming up right now.
Morning, everyone. Great to be here with you all. For those of you who are not familiar, Green Lining is a research and public policy nonprofit, and we've been advocating for racial equity for 28 years. So yes, Green Lining was a participant in TJAG. And first of all, I just want to say how much I appreciate all of the researchers, the program managers involved in this effort. As a researcher myself, I know how much just love and labor goes into projects like these. And I think it was really exciting to hear all of the interesting and useful findings today from this research. So I'll say, the TJAG structure was definitely a new and innovative approach to kind of bringing together a crossroads of transportation equity, EJ experts into this research. And, just like any new approach, there was lots of things that worked well. There was lots of real cool opportunities to hear about a wide breadth of research. And of course, at the same time, we all learned about the opportunities for growth and improvement. I'll just say off the bat that, my feedback is not really actually about the actual research projects themselves. I can't really speak to them because I wasn't super involved in them. Although, again, it sounds like there were some really valuable community partnerships and participation. So I'll just kind of focus my feedback and recommendations more so about, when and how the TJAG advisors were brought into the process and how we could improve upon this in the future. And as well, I think my recommendations are really directed at like the larger research fields, right? I will say, for myself, this participation in TJAG was actually one of those key experiences and indicators to me that the research field really needed more clear standards and guidelines around how to do more equitable partnership-based research. I observed that everyone only had the best of intentions, but there were just all kinds of institutional barriers to reaching our shared goals. And so I actually decided to write this report that I'll drop in a link into the chat that really outlines how can equity be built in from start to finish throughout research processes and practices. Next slide, please. So these were the problems that we identified. And I should again say that these are not specifically targeted to the research project shared today. I actually think, especially after hearing today, that these projects did a really good job at addressing many of these problems here. Again, these problems here are targeted towards the larger research field more broadly and are really based on Green Lining's years of experience of participating as advisors and seeing a whole range of how research is done. So first, now there is so much more funding for the study of equity, and that is super exciting, right? I mean, many research grants actually require some element of equity to be built in. But I'd say there's an issue here around, there's a huge gap in the field around what does it mean to actually study and measure equity. Second, the field also needs standards on how to conduct that research, equity research, in an equitable way. So for example, sometimes when researchers are studying equity impacts, the way they can go about it, unfortunately, is a bit non-reciprocal. It can be extractive. It can be culturally insensitive. For example, we've seen research partners receive funding, but then it becomes clear that they didn't actually have that necessary equity expertise. And they end up leaning on us or other equity organizations to help fill those gaps. Not bad intentions, but unfortunately, we don't get the same credit. We don't get the same funding, even if that's a topic that we have been studying for years. We're also asked to be on a million advisory committees every year. I would say previously there were generally uncompensated. That is changing rapidly, and that's fantastic, right? But at the same time, oftentimes there's not the opportunity to meaningfully shape the research. For example, the research scope and methodology is often completely finalized by the time it's shared with the advisory committee. And so I think what this shows is that while it's great that equity is the main focus or the question of the research, we have to ensure that equity is embedded throughout the research process, throughout identifying the research questions, the design, and the implementation. I also want to be clear, all of this here is not solely the researcher's fault. These are systemic issues that really stem all the way up to the research institutions and to the research funders. And I also want to be clear, there are so many folks actually in this webinar today who are really trying to flip this paradigm. Many of the CSTAC projects today that are really trying to move the envelope. And so that is actually also what got Greenlining thinking that we have to standardize a new kind of approach to equity-based research because there's just so much variety across the board, right? Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of the 5 steps that we identified in this research. First, understand the context of racism and research in the past and present. Second, review the challenges and best practices for centering racial equity in research. Third, conduct an equity assessment of your research institution or team. Fourth, partner with and pay a community partner. And then fifth, co-create the research questions and scope of work with a community partner. Now I'll say what made this report, this 50-page report, so comprehensive was that it was essentially a crowdsourced report. We had 30 plus reviewers from research funders, which included state agencies, research institutions, researchers, community partners from really around the country contribute to this report. Again, many of those folks are actually in this webinar, so huge thank you all to you, as well as many of the CSTAC researchers and TJAG coordinators involved as well. So I'll go into each step in a bit more detail, but just for the purposes of keeping within this time limit, I'm just going to focus on steps 2 to 5. Next slide, please. So step 2 asks the research field to review the many challenges, institutional barriers, and best practices for centering racial equity in research. To give a super high-level overview, we categorize those challenges and best practices into different groups within the field, really with the goal of emphasizing that this responsibility lies across the entire research field. So first, research institutions and funders should understand how their funding structures and timelines can undercut community engagement and involvement, and how a lack of diversity and cultural competency can create blinders. Next, researchers should first establish long-term trust with the communities they wish to study, rather than seeking a superficial equity stamp of approval. They should give community partners a meaningful role in the design and conduct of the research. Next, community partners need their capacity and resources built up in order to lead their own research and collaborate on research partnerships. So the report offers about 16 pages of super detailed examples and best practices on how each of these groups can accomplish these goals. Next slide, please. The third step is an equity assessment of your research institution or team. This is a thought exercise for researchers to set a baseline of where they're even at, have a discussion around their strengths, any gaps, and identify potential next steps to address those gaps. Again, the full assessment is quite extensive, but these are just a few of the questions. What is your team or organization's understanding of institutional racism, power, and systems change? What is the unique role of your organization in the larger equity fields? And how can your position advance rather than duplicate the work of others? Does your team sufficiently budget for community engagement activities, such as the ability to pay interviewees for their time and expertise? So after they complete the assessment, there's also a reflection portion which guides the user through a brainstorm of how to address those gaps. Next slide, please. So step 4 is that the researchers should partner and pay a community partner. Unfortunately, there are so many barriers to doing this well. So for example, in one of our partnerships, the grant guidelines say that the university can only contract out 20% of the budget to an outside party, which is us. Again, not the fault of the researcher. This is an upstream issue from grant funders. But again, still huge responsibility of researchers and their institutions to push back on these kinds of structural barriers that don't allow folks like us to be full partners. Another issue is that many researchers may not have ongoing trusting relationships with community partners. And while it's great that the TJEDG members were compensated, however, I would say that most of us that regularly participated were actually policy advocates. Many of us were high-level grasstops organizations. And even if we had expertise in a specific research topic, we may not always be the most appropriate folks to speak to the local needs of that community. And so that's why it's always so important to keep building those relationships with the appropriate local organizations, build up their capacity, ensure that they have more representation in spaces like TJEDG. Next slide, please. So the fifth and final step is to co-create your research scope of work with a community partner. So the purpose of this worksheet is to really co-create how equity will show up from start to finish. Again, a super extensive worksheet boiled down to a few sample questions here. How will your research align with and support existing community priorities? How will you design a process to collaborate with the target populations in a meaningful way? How will you bring an equity lens to data analysis? How will you share as much decision-making power as possible? So I think that this step 5 is really a great lesson learned for TJEDG. Just because of the way the RFP was set up, by the time TJEDG was brought in to advise, unfortunately, there wasn't really an ability to change or influence the research scope because it had already been kind of funded and approved. Again, that's not to say that the research questions and the scopes were not reflective of community needs. It sounds like a lot of community partners were intimately involved from the start in co-developing the research scopes of work, and that's fantastic, right? But for the rest of TJEDG, there just wasn't as much opportunity to weigh in. And so moving forward, I would love to see researchers and TJEDG co-create potential future research projects from the very beginning so that we can be sure there is strategic alignment between both community needs and policy priorities. And so I hope that the guiding questions from this step 5 can help to facilitate that process. Next slide, please. So in terms of implementation, these recommendations have been adapted to the California Air Resources Board framework for equity and research. And this co-creation model and equitable partnership is being kind of tested out and piloted in an implementation of various research collaborations, which I'll share a bit more about in the next slide, please. So I would say that, ideally these 5 steps that I shared happen in beautiful order, but in practice, these steps actually don't happen in that way because the research funding process is just not set up like that. It's not common to be funded to co-develop a scope of work before you've actually received the funds, right? So in this project with UC Berkeley that was funded by CARB, we were invited to co-develop and contribute to a proposed scope of work, that was unpaid, kind of in an unofficial way. But then the funding, was received, and we were then brought on as paid advisors. Greenlining conducted an internal equity self-assessment for that research team. We also did a similar thing with the University of Oregon to help set that baseline for where the team was at, where do we need to go, and how do we get there. Next, we began to coordinate our overlapping and existing research and find kind of complementary approaches and skill sets. And then lastly, along with the other paid equity advisors and researchers, we co-defined our vision for equity, and we'll hopefully weigh in on additional key decision points along the way. Again, even with these research collaborations that are trying to kind of undo some of these aspects, of course, we encountered institutional barriers, but I would say, we're definitely getting closer to that model. I would say from my own perspective, particularly with the University of Oregon project, because I've been involved from day one, I do feel so much more committed and have so much more ownership over this form of research compared to others that I advised. Last slide, please. And I would just love to see how groups like TJAG, could exist long before new research begins. And so that folks have, more capacity to be involved in shaping and co-creating research questions and needs from the very beginning. And I think, if TJAG were organized in this way, the kind of catch is that this actually still requires the buy-in and support by the entire research field, right? Because we know that RFPs, research grants, research institutions still have to incentivize and in some cases require these equitable partnerships. And just to close out, I just want to underscore that really the entire research field will benefit from these types of equitable partnerships. We'll produce more research that's just inherently more equitable, more grounded in community needs. And so that's why I do see so much potential in efforts like TJAG and CSTAC. So thanks so much, and looking forward to conversations with the rest of the panelists.
Hannah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Your presentation was a perfect way to round out our presentations and transition into our panel discussion. I'd like to invite all of our panelists to turn back on their cameras and join us. And I'd like to invite our audience members to keep those questions coming in the box. As Hannah mentioned, she provided a lot of insight and a lot of ideas about how we could create more equity in our research projects. I'm going to send my first question out to our researchers. We'll start with Jen, then go to Caroline, and then go to Alex. But really asking you what you think could be different, either about the funding streams, about how the research projects are created, or the timelines that you would think might help your research be more centered in equity. And I'll start with Jen.
That's a big question. And I'm going to say that a lot of comments on the last presentation are really relevant. It takes resources to do a really good job if you're going to collaborate. In our case, we did subcontract to the CELA Collaborative, and we did pay them. And we wouldn't have been able to do what we did if we hadn't done that. But it was still a struggle to get the subcontract done and approved and all of that. I think that this type of research takes longer because the interactions with the community need to take place over a period of time. You can't just walk in there and say, I'd like to do a focus group. Won't you please come and talk to me? It doesn't work that way. You actually need to lay all the groundwork beforehand. And you need to interact frequently. And often we don't budget for the amount of interaction that really is required to do this in kind of what I would consider kind of the right way. So I think it does come down to funding. It comes down to timeline. And it comes down to those of us who are researchers doing a lot of homework before we ever get to the proposal stage. So I'll stop there and give someone else a chance.
Great, thanks so much. Caroline, do you have any thoughts to add? Oops, unmute, please.
Sorry, I was having a hard time with my mouse.
No problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see a lot of calls for feasibility analyses. I'm interested in, for these transportation type pilots. And I think my opinion is that the funding level is far too low to adequately incorporate, the development of a relationship with community-based organization. So I think that, that's a really critical time to hopefully identify before, but then spend time with boots on the ground during that period to establish a productive relationship to achieve the goals that Hannah indicated. I also just want to make another comment to agencies. Many times I find that it's very difficult to pay incentives for surveys because of restrictions in the grant. We'll have to use gift funding or other methods. I mean, so that's something that agencies can look at. It's a not uncommon barrier.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. We're hearing that just in any community engagement outreach, not specifically even to research, but we're hearing that a lot as well. Alex, can we hear from you? What would you like to add to that?
I guess some things that I've been thinking about after having completed this project are more equitable and more community-based ways of collecting data itself. I've seen other projects where researchers have hired members of the community to deploy surveys and even to help analyze the results of the survey. And I think that's another way to kind of get communities more involved in the process of research and guiding what questions we're asking in surveys and how we're interpreting those findings into actionable policy recommendations or initiatives after the surveys and the research has been completed.
Great, thank you. I'm actually going to go to Dahlia as well, just to give a little bit more context. This was a $2.6 million project that was funded by the Strategic Growth Council. We heard about 3 of the place-based projects today. There were a few more as well as 3 other projects and the TJAG group that kind of were a thread throughout all the projects. So Dahlia, as someone who managed such a large project with so many researchers, with so many partners, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question.
Right. So, I mean, I think it wasn't just 3 big projects, like kind of statewide projects and 3 local projects, but each of those 6 projects had about 3 sub-projects that were really kind of distinct. So we heard about 3 out of maybe 12 to 16 of the really, this was a huge undertaking and very diverse in terms of the research that we did. I will say that I think that this project really pushed us to include equity and to include community-based organizations in a way that we hadn't been kind of pushed before, and we had started developing these relationships. But what I've seen come out of it is that we have now this relationship with various partners through our project advisory groups, through the TJAG, and we're building now projects moving forward based on the relationships that this built. And I think that's really helpful. And just on a technicality, what I've found is really helpful is a pre-proposal phase in terms of developing new projects. Because if you go straight to proposal, the timeline is usually so short that you're trying to build a relationship, find partners, figure out how you're going to address the diversity that is California, which is no small feat, and in a very short timeline. And so finding a pre-proposal allows us to get the ball moving and then more time to really co-build a statement of work for a full proposal.
Thank you. Thank you. I know Hannah and Abigail, you both have been working in disadvantaged communities for a very long time. You have been working to, really center equity at so many, just not even research projects, but other projects as well, on the ground, boots on the ground projects, and just within community engagement as a whole. I do want to thank you both for joining us. I want to thank this group and all the others, I'm assuming, that are on the call as well, for really getting in this space. It's kind of a vulnerable place to be now as we start to explore how to make things more equitable. We really wanted to center this conversation in that really vulnerable space. We wanted to open up to new questions, new way of thinking about things. As both Hannah and Abigail mentioned, there are some processes and some institutions that we probably need to reconsider and rethink. But a lot of it begins with just looking at what we're doing now and really in an open environment explaining what other things can be done. So we are kind of running a bit short on time. We just do have about 8 more minutes, and I have a few more resources to share. But Abigail, and I'll start with Hannah and then end with Abigail. Do you have any other thoughts on just where to go from here?
Yeah, so I think TJADGE has a really strong representation of policy advocates, right? And so I would love to see how we can kind of early on coordinate those policy priorities, but going both ways. So for example, I just heard a lot of people talking about barriers to paying communities for taking surveys, challenges with subcontracting. That's something that Greenlining is seeing across the board, from research, from the implementation of programs. And so I think because TJADGE is such a unique ecosystem with different, CBOs, policy wonks, advocates, I would just love to see how that can be a space where we can coordinate various policy priorities, because chances are we're thinking about a lot of these things in the same way. And I think that can be a really kind of powerful partnership.
Great. Thanks so much. Abigail, thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of was covered in Hannah's presentation. I really appreciated her recommendations at the end there. I do think that there's a few other things that we can do together. It sounds like we really all need to be advocating for some systematic changes when it comes to CARB or to the CEC in terms of how much they allow your institutions to spend on community outreach and engagement, right? Because if there's a cap, obviously we all feel that it should be more. I think together we can do better at getting the message across that perhaps we need to, now is the time to increase that amount. But also I'd like folks to consider something different. We work with various institutions, various universities, and our experiences is great. However, there are some hurdles sometimes for getting payments out, for executing new contracts with the university. And I think it's maybe time that we consider that the CBO be the primary funder, be the primary recipient of the funding, because for us, for example, at South Enterprises, it is much easier for us to get over these hurdles. We don't have such bureaucracy to go through, and we can easily be the agency that funds out to the university. So consider changing the funding structure. And then lastly, I will say, I do like the idea of a planning stage or the needs assessments and taking the time to work with communities early on. But in addition to that, someone, I think it was Hannah who said earlier, if you work with the local community groups, then you work with the groups that already have those relationships in place. Right. So I think that is why it's key. We have worked with some communities for 10, 20, 30 years. So it is very easy for us to go in there and show years of documented outreach and relationships. And that will help to make these applications stronger when you have real existing relationships. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that. Again, I want to applaud this group of fabulous women. They are dedicated, they are passionate, and they are really making things happen on the ground. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and share a few more resources like we talked about. We can go ahead to the next slide. ILG has a bunch of different resources. We are just wrapping up a community-based community engagement program in the city of San Diego. We'd love you to stay connected with us either on Facebook, Twitter, or sign up for our newsletter. We consistently have new resources and try to share different information, not only from the research field, but others to try to inform public policy. Next slide, please. And like we were talking about earlier, this is just a small snippet of a gigantic project that we've all been working on for about 2.5 years. And so the link you see on your screen right now is to the broader page that contains all the individual findings and research of all the projects involved in the CSTAC project that was funded by the Strategic Growth Council. So we certainly want to encourage you to do that, and also want to thank the Strategic Growth Council for funding this project. And again, everyone for all of their efforts, and thank you to the audience for joining us on this call today. Thank you and have a great afternoon. We appreciate you being with us. Bye-bye all.